Hey guys, Shane at Titan Rig. I talk to you guys on Reddit and Facebook every day. I've shared a lot of great information with you guys and shown you a lot of great products. Today we got something a little special that I wanted to do a video on because I didn't think an article and pictures would really get close enough to it and show you exactly what it is. We're going to take this thing, we're going to get our hands on it, we're going to take it apart, we're going to show you how it works, and we're going to show you how to install it. So let's get to it. First off, big thanks to EK for sending us one of their newest products to take a look at. This is the EK Quantum Vector FTW3 308090 full coverage water block with active backplate set. And I'm pretty proud of getting that out in one take. Doesn't really roll off the tongue, does it? But guys, I gotta tell you, I should probably just show you. I want you to keep in mind that this is a box for a water block. Just let that sink in for just a second. Okay, let's see what's in here. Wow. I feel like there should be trumpets and a choir playing somewhere. That'll do. It looks huge here, but you can really only see half of it. It's actually this big. This is an enormous piece of hardware. It's also one of the most beautiful pieces of water cooling hardware I've ever seen. The acrylic is perfect. The nickel plating is shiny. Throw in the black accents and the RGB lighting, man, this thing is a winner. I got into water cooling because I like to tinker with things, but things like this keep me here. So what are we going to do with this? We're going to mount this on a card. But before we can do that, we're going to have to prep our victim. So let's set this aside and see what we have to work with. Oh. Here I have the EVGA 3080 FTW3 Ultra. Now, I'll admit I'm behind the times running a 2080 in my machine, but this is easily the biggest video card I've ever held. This thing is the size of a loaf of bread. This is why that is the size it is. The whole card is absolutely beautiful, but as pretty as this air cooler is, we got something better. So let's prep this thing for install. All right, we've got a card on a workbench to start prepping it to put that block on there, but there's a couple of things I want to point out to you guys before we start. If you look on the edge of the card right here, there are 3 power connectors on the edge. These are for your fans. And there's another one, just like it on the end here, for your RGB lighting. Now, we're obviously going to have to unplug those before we pull the cooler, but right now there's not enough room here to unplug them and pull them out of the way, so we'll unplug those after we get the cooler loose, but before we pull it all the way off. Just remember those are there when it comes time. We're going to start with the back plate. The back plate's held on there with Phillips screws. You'll need a number 1 Phillips to take those off. And there's 9 screws total around here. This screw right here, when I got the card, it had a sticker over it, an EVGA sticker. And since these screws are flush with the back plate, it was impossible to see there was even a screw there. You never would have known that was there. So I can see someone missing that screw and trying to take it apart with the screw still in there and damaging their card. So if you do find a small EVGA sticker on your back plate, you'll take your finger and push on it like this and rub on that sticker. If you see a round dent appear in the middle of it, then that means there's a screw under there. So you can actually take it off, take the screw out without pulling the sticker. You just take your screwdriver and put it in that dent and push down. It'll engage the screw and you can just pull it out right through the sticker. Now, some people would tell you that sticker is an anti-tamper sticker, that you're going to void your warranty if you break it. That's not the case. EVGA has one of the best warranties in the business. They don't care if you put a water block on your card, so you're not going to void any warranties by doing this. Just treat it like the other screws. And we've got 9 screws all the way around here. 5 of those screws are just regular. They've got a threaded insert in the bottom. They just screw right out. The other 4, however, have got nuts on the bottom of them. We'll get to those in a second. I've got a little bowl here that I like to keep around because I lose screws and small parts pretty easily. So we're going to go ahead and take out these 5 simple screws first. Let's start up here where the sticker was. And that is the 5 easy ones. Probably this one is probably the easiest one to show you guys what we're talking about. On the back side of the circuit board, there's a little bitty nut holding a screw on there. So we're going to have something to hold on to that nut while we turn the screw. I found these small needle nose pliers like this work really well for this. So we're going to take our needle nose pliers and we're just going to reach up underneath here and hold the nut like so, and then turn the screw just like we did the others, and that'll come off. You can just drop it in your bowl and move to the next one. Now, these are all pretty easy, except this is the only one that caused any kind of problem for me because the nut is kind of way up inside here behind the I/O plate. So you really got to reach your pliers up in there and grab it and hold it. It's a little bit harder to get to than the others, but not too bad. Once you got a hold of it, you turn your screw, and that'll come off, and you can pull the screw out. Like I said, there's 4 of these alongside the 5 others. And this one on the corner. There's your nut. And none of the hardware we're pulling off now is going to be needed for the water block installation. So just keep track of it, but you're not going to need it later. There's that last nut and the last screw. At that point, we can take our back plate and just lift it right off. Now that puts us almost ready to pull this cooler, but there's one more thing holding this thing on. This clip right here is still attached to, it goes through the circuit board and into the cooler on the bottom. This actually holds the cooler up against the GPU die. So we got to take this off, but GPU dies can be brittle, so we got to be careful how we do this one. We need to take it off and release the pressure evenly so we don't put too much pressure on one side of the die and crack it. So the best way I found to do that is just put your screwdriver in here. You're going to turn this screw back 1 turn. Just like that. Just 1 turn. And if you move to the next one and turn it the same way, back it off 1 turn, and 1 turn, and 1 turn, just like that. That releases the pressure evenly off the die so you don't wind up with uneven pressure on one side. You can see it's starting to lift up here. This clip is actually under quite a bit of tension, but these screws are actually attached to the clip, so they're not going to fly off on you. This will actually all come off as an assembly. Turn 1 more turn, and just keep going backward with them 1 turn at a time, and you'll have one of them pop off first, and then the other should follow immediately after. There's that one. There goes our first corner, second corner, and the last one. There we go. Now our clip's off. We can set that aside. And at that point, there is nothing else mechanical holding this thing on. We don't try and lift it up and pull it off there just yet. There's a little bit of a process to getting it off from this point. So we got all our mechanical fasteners off here. Now we just have to get this thing off of the card off of the cooler. Now, you would think with all the mechanical fasteners off there, it would just pop right off, but it's not, and I'll tell you why. On the other side, between the card and the cooler, here, and all around here, there is thermal paste and thermal pads that have been on there under pressure for quite a while, and they are not going to want to let go. So what we got to do is coax it into letting go of the card. And the best way to do that is to grab your air cooler here in one hand, the card in this hand, and just twist it. Just twist it real gently like this, little by little, and you'll loosen those up. And remember, we're trying to coax it off there, not force it, so be real gentle with it. As you work like this, it will start moving a little bit more freely. A little more freely. You can start, when it gets to moving like this, you can pull outward just a little bit. And boom, there it goes. Now, I will warn you guys, yours is going to be harder than it was for me. I've already had this card apart and cleaned the thermal paste off, so the only thing holding it on for me was the thermal pads. So if it seems harder for you than that looked, that's why. Nothing to worry about. But now that we have this loose, remember we still have these power cords to deal with. Now these cords have got a tab right here. All you got to do to get these off here, you'll grab a hold of the wire, and if you push this tab in and pull on that wire, carefully. Now, you can either push that tab in or you can lift up on this part if you can get a tool under it. It does the same thing. So you want to move your card around to give yourself a little more room for each one. You have enough room to grab the wire. And we're going to lift up on this part of the tab, pull the wire. Oh, there it goes. And then, last one, we're going to lift up on this part of the tab, pull the wire. Boom. Now it gets kind of exciting right there, but don't pull it yet because we got one more to do. RGB tab down here, which is a little easier to get to now that we have some room. We can just push down on that and actually pull the card. There we have it. The naked card and the air cooler. Now, I will say the air cooler, you should probably keep a hold of that. I always put the hardware and stuff back with the air cooler and put it in a box and keep it. If you have any trouble with your video card at any point, you have to deal with the warranty system. They're going to want you to put this back on before you send it in to them. And even if you don't have any trouble, if later on you decide you want to sell the card, it's a lot easier to sell them with the air cooler included. So I would hang on to this. Obviously take your thermal pads off, but I would hang on to it. Oh. Now, when I got the card, there was thermal paste down this entire line here, and down here, and of course on the die. The memory chips all had thermal pads on them. There were thermal pads here as well. And I already cleaned these up because nobody wants to watch a grown man scrape gray goo for half an hour, but you need to make sure and get all the thermal paste off of everything. It can be a tedious process, but it needs to be clean before you're done. Okay, so we got our card ready, but we got a little bit of work to do to our block before we can put it on there. There's a couple smaller boxes that came in the big box from EVGA, so let's take a look and see what they sent us here. And here we have, looks like a hardware kit. We've got screws, washers, a couple of plugs for the terminal block. It's like some spare O-rings. That's pretty handy. We've got two metal hex drivers, two different sizes. We've got EVGA's Loop Connect hex driver, a female hex driver, and a little tube of EVGA's thermal paste, which we will get into that a little later. And our second box, what's in here? Ah, thermal pads. We'll need those too. We'll set that aside right now. So looking at this block assembly, sometimes it can be hard to tell, especially with this mirror block setup, which side is your water block and which side is the back plate. So I'm going to show you how to tell those two apart. If you look right here at your cooling fins on this one, it only has 5 big cooling fins. And on this side, it has a lot of much smaller cooling fins, a lot more surface area, a lot more heat transfer here. This side is going to be your water block. This goes on the die side of the card. This is going to be your back plate. You can always tell just by looking at the cooling fins. We've got a little bit of prep work to do to it before we can put it on our card, but the first thing we need to do is peel this plastic off because all the screws we need to get to are underneath the plastic. I love that part. We've got some work to do because as you can see, the water block and the back plate ship pre-assembled. That's fantastic for shipping and it looks great, but it means we got a little bit of work to do first. Now if you look at this piece here, this is called the terminal block. This controls the flow of water as it comes in, it goes through the back plate and out into the block and through and then back out this side. It also holds these two pieces together, so we've got to take this loose. Now, we're only going to take one side loose. If you look at these nameplates here, these are beautiful additions and I really like these. They are also practical. So you'll watch, you push on one side of it, it pops up, and it's a magnetically held cover that covers up the screws that hold this terminal block in place. We're going to use this Allen wrench that EVGA supplied with the box. There's 3 screws in here. We're going to take those out. We're only taking out the bottom set. There's no need to take the terminal block off of the back plate. We're only taking it out of the water block itself. So we're going to turn these. 3 screws in here. There we go. Cup here to put screws in. There they are. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so that has the terminal block loose, but the backplate itself is still attached. For that, we're going to need the same #1 Phillips screwdriver we used on the card. We used to take these screws off. Around the outside of all these Phillips screws, they're going to have to come off. There's nothing special about these. There's no nuts on them or anything. They just unscrew. So we'll start here. And again, these are all identical, so there's no need to try and keep track of which ones go in which position. 2. And while we're taking these off, you'll notice these screws around here that are hex drive, those actually hold the water block to this piece of acrylic on the active backplate. There's no reason to touch those. We're leaving that block alone. All we're doing is separating the backplate from the water block. So leave these screws alone. All you're doing if you take those loose is asking for a leak around this O-ring. They're tightened from the factory, and unless you have problems, they should never need to be touched. So we have this one, and one more here. And there we go, there's all of those. Now at this point, this back plate will lift. You'll take it out, pull it this direction a little bit first, and then slide it out like this. And there we go, back plate is off. I want to show you this first, where that terminal block went. You can see these two ovals right here. These are the O-rings that seal the coolant, make a seal for the coolant between the steel and the plastic on the terminal block. Those are pretty delicate little O-rings. They're easy to knock off. So at this point, just make sure they're actually in their groove. If you read through the manual, EVGA recommends that we pull these during this installation, but like 4 steps later, they tell you to put them back. In my experience, these should be left alone as much as possible. They're well seated in their grooves. They're not raised, they're not damaged. They feel good. I'm going to leave them exactly where they are. You look under here where the card and the block, where the back plate and the screws were, we've got something here from EVGA that's turned out to be pretty helpful. This is a 1-to-1 representation of the water block itself, and this is where your thermal pads will go. They're all color-coded by thickness. If you look over here, the green ones need to be 1 millimeter, and the blue ones are 2 millimeter, and it shows you exactly where to put them on the block. Pretty handy. We'll get into that here in a second when we take a look at it when we're actually putting the thermal pads on. But for now, we need to pull these standoffs out of here. This tool that EVGA supplied with the box is perfect for this. We'll just slip it over the top of the standoff and unscrew it like that. And that's what we're removing, these little chrome standoffs. Put them here. These are what hold the back plate. The screws that we just took out, as a matter of fact, were screwed into these that holds the back plate onto the block set. All right, there we go. We'll set this out of the way. We'll talk about that here in a minute when we deal with our thermal pads. Right here, you can see these are more standoffs that those standoffs were screwed into. At this point, you need to make sure that none of these came loose while you were unscrewing those upper standoffs. It's not hard. They're just screwed into acrylic, so they could actually turn with the upper standoffs and come loose. If they do, I don't know if you can see in the camera here, but if they do, these are not hexagon like the other standoffs. These are round, but they have 2 flats on them, a flat on each side. So if you do need to tighten these up, you can use those same needle nose pliers we used earlier to just give them a little gentle snug. Don't over tighten them because they're just screwed into acrylic, but make sure those stay tight. So now that the back plate's off, the standoffs are off, the card's out of the way, we're looking at the actual back plate. We're looking at the actual water block that fits on your card. Your GPU die goes here. These are all beautifully machined. And these are all set to fit this particular card in specific thicknesses of thermal pads. But we'll get into that with the thermal pads. But the block and at this point, the block and the back plate are torn down and ready to go. So we're going to set this aside and get that card back over here and start prepping that to get the block installed. All right, we've got our naked card here. We need to get it ready to install the new water block. The first thing we need to do, we're gonna have to put thermal interface on this thing to make sure it makes good contact with the water block for maximum cooling potential. We're gonna use thermal pads and thermal paste both. But the first thing you wanna do before you use any kind of thermal material is clean it. Clean the surface you're gonna put it on. I like to use 99% alcohol in one of these cleaning swabs. They do a really good job and they don't leave any kind of lint or debris behind. So I'll just dip a swab down in the alcohol, squeeze a little bit out. And we'll go over all the areas we're going to put our thermal material. Now, a high purity alcohol like this won't leave anything behind. So you don't have to worry about it leaving any kind of a residue. I'll wipe it on real thick like that and take a dry swab just like it and wipe down behind it to make sure it's as clean as we can get it. That also helps the thermal pads stick in place and do their job. So we're going to clean over here. We're going to be putting a thermal pad here. And because it will evaporate without leaving anything, you don't have to worry about getting it on any of the circuits or anything because it'll evaporate and not cause any problems with your capacitors or VRM circuits. We cleaned our VRM setup. We're going to clean the memory chips because they're going to get thermal pads as well. These are all your VRAM chips around the processor. Like that. Just clean those up. Take your dry one, wipe them down. There's also going to be thermal pads here and here. We'll wipe those off. And then the GPU die itself, we want to make sure we get it really clean. It's going to get thermal paste, but it needs to be as clean as we can get it as well. There we go. At that point, it is ready to apply our thermal pads. The block set comes with more than enough thermal pads to do the job, but they're not cut to size. We have, but I showed you earlier, it does come with this handy guide for your thermal pads. It shows a 1-to-1 ratio of the size of the card and which pads go where as far as your thickness is concerned. So each of these, as you can see looking at here and looking at our color code on the other side, orange is 1 millimeter. So we know that all of the thermal pads that are going on this side are 1 millimeter thick. And because this is an image of the card that's 1-to-1, this will show you exactly the size, length, width of the thermal pads you're going to put on here. So whenever you need to take your thermal pads that came with it, you just lay it on here like this, take a magic marker and mark on the pad the size you need it to be and cut it to fit. I've already cut all the thermal pads for this to save time. But when you put thermal pads on, you have to peel the plastic off of them. There's a plastic coating on both sides, and they don't work very well with that on there. So what we're going to do, we're going to move this down so I can see what we're doing with this. Your thermal pads have got usually a dark blue side and a clear side on your plastic. There are two different kinds of plastic here. Tweezers help. You can use your fingernail or pocket knife, but tweezers I found are the best. Reach up under that plastic, peel it off like this. Set that aside. Now you want to take your thermal pad and lay it. In this case, this one goes over here. Put it where it's going to go. Now rub it down a little bit to make sure it's got a good contact. Then you can take your tool and grab that plastic and peel it right off. We've got several more to do here, as you can see from the guide. So we'll get that done and then we'll move on to the thermal paste. And through the magic of editing, our thermal pads are done. I've also taken the sample of EK's Ecotherm thermal paste that they supplied with the block and put it on our GPU die. Now, there's a lot of different opinions on how you should put thermal paste on a CPU or a GPU die. In this case, I went with EK's recommendation. They prefer the X-shaped application from corner to corner, so that's what we did. So at this point, this card is ready to go, and we'll have to set it aside and start getting our block ready to install. So we've got our card set up, ready to put on the block, but there's one thing we're going to need to do before we can put it on there. This I/O plate on the back is actually thicker than our water block is. So before we can put it on there, we need to elevate this up a little bit to make room for the I/O card, the I/O plate to hang off the side. Doesn't matter what you use, just something soft that's not going to scratch your acrylic. Lift it up about 1 inch, will be more than enough to make up the space. I've got it elevated up here about 1 inch now, so it'll hang off the side. And at that point, we can just take our card, we can flip it over, line up the screw holes, and just kind of lower it down onto it. Make sure your screws line up. And there we go. Now once we got our block elevated and our card laid flat on it like this, we're going to take our screws. The block came with a bunch of these small black Phillips head screws and plastic washers. We need to put 7 of those in here and make sure that the washers are on the screws. That's important. We're going to need 7 of these little suckers here. I think it came with like 10. We're going to put those, 4 of these are going to go in the GPU die position. And we put all of these in. We do not want to tighten them down at all. Just make sure they're in their threads and started, but leave them loose. And I'll explain why here in just a minute. There you go. Just make sure they're not going to come out, so they're started in the threads. Leave enough room. Leave them loose enough that you can move them. One down there by that one. We have one up here. And the last one is going to go through this bracket on the I/O plate. And tighten down right there. Okay. But again, leave them loose, and I'll tell you why. Each of these holes is actually quite a bit bigger than the screw, so leaving them loose allows you to wiggle the card around a little bit if you need to. And we're liable to need to. Our next step is going to be to put these standoffs back that we took off initially. These are what the back plate rides on. So we're just going to put these in by hand first. And again, now these you can twist down until they're at the bottom, but we'll tighten them up with the tool once we get them all in there. The card and the block assembly are now completely finished and ready to go. We got one more step. We're going to have to prep the card a little bit more and then put our active backplate on and we'll be done. All right, so we got our card all together and mounted to our water block. The next thing we got to do is prep this to put the backplate on, and that involves the thermal pads just like the other side did. I've got the guide here that came with the block that shows us our thermal pads. And according to the guide here, we've got 1mm pads here on the memory chips and 2mm pads everywhere else on the GPU die and on the VRM circuits. Now also, if you look down here, this is what caught my attention. It says, drawing is illustrative representation of the 3090 backplate thermal pad placement. For other variations, please scan the QR code and refer to user manual for product spec details. Obviously, we're not working with a 3090, so I went ahead and scanned these QR codes. These are dead links. It looks like the display card that we got is a little out of date, but thankfully EK's already got their manual updated that comes, the PDF manual. So what I found out was that these pads for a 3080 install like ours, these pads need to be thicker than they are in a 3090. Reason being the 3080 doesn't have memory chips on this side. So since the 3090 does, it uses 1mm pads. The 3080 has no chips here. It needs 2mm pads to make up the gap. So remember that if you're working with a 3080, it needs thicker pads. Everything on this side is going to be 2mm. Everything on the other side is 1mm. It's pretty easy to remember, but 3080s use thicker pads. So I'm going to go ahead and start putting these thermal pads on here where they go. And we know some of these go on the memory chips. Obviously there's no memory chips on this side, but if we take a look at here, you can see these big solder points here. This is where your memory chips are at. So that's how you can tell where to put your thermal pads on this side. That's where they're soldered on. And your VRM circuitry is going to be all these little holes here, but you want to put it closer this direction because all this complicated circuitry right here is part of it as well. So when we put these on, we want to put it close to these pins. Like this. The pins just to the side of it, and just like that. Stick it on, peel our plastic. Oh, come on. And we're done. So I've got several more pieces to put on here, and then we'll talk about actually putting the backplate on. All right, and our pads are done. So we've got one final step here, and that's to put this active backplate onto the card. Now we're going to, just like when we lowered the card straight down onto the water block, we're going to do the same thing with this, but we need to be a little bit offset when we put it down. I don't know if you can see here. This is your terminal block right here. This is where those O-rings sit. Here we go. So if we bring it straight down, it's liable to hit those O-rings and knock them loose. So I always try and bring it in this direction by just a couple of millimeters and bring it down and then slide it into place. This particular application, you got this RGB lighting strip is going to have to come in. There's a slot here. It's going to have to come in like this first and tuck it in that slot before you can lower it. And then draw it toward you a little bit, set it down, and then push it in against those O-rings. That way you're not going to come straight down and damage and knock one of those O-rings loose. I've had that happen, and when it happens, you usually don't know about it until you have a leak. So now we're going to take a look at our screw holes, make sure they're all lined up. All right, and we're going to put our screws in. Now, just like before, I want to put these screws in the holes, but I'm going to leave them loose so that if I need to move anything around, I can. So make sure they're in the threads. And that way, if you need to make adjustments as you go, you'll be able to. If you tighten down two of them, then they won't move at all. So just leave them loose for now, and once they're all in place, then we'll tighten them up. And remember when you're putting these in, that these screws go into standoffs that are screwed into acrylic. So not only do they go through acrylic and tighten down, they force another set of standoffs to tighten down in acrylic. So don't over tighten them. Remember that this is not sealing anything. There's no coolant sealed under this thing with these screws. That's what these screws are for. So there's no need to get it really tight to worry about a seal. This is strictly mechanical holding. Now see, that one isn't lined up quite right, so I've got to, there you go, move the card just a little bit to line it up. And over here, that one didn't quite line up either. There it goes. Just a little bit of wiggle room is usually all you need. Our last one of these. Okay, once those are all in, then we can take our Allen wrench that EK supplied and these three screws we took out of our terminal block. Put those in there also loose. Just make sure they're grabbing their threads and tightening up like they're supposed to. Okay. And these, since the backplate has to go down for these to line up, the backplate is probably sitting on the thermal pads. These may not line up right off the bat because it's still high sitting on the pads until you tighten these down. So if they don't go into their threads, don't worry about it. Try it again once you tighten these down and draw the backplate down onto the pads like they're supposed to be. Your holes are probably too high at this point. So let's go ahead and tighten these up, and that will pull our backplate down to where it's supposed to be. Like I said, don't over tighten these, but you don't have to worry about a sequence. There's no pressure sensitive components under it except the acrylic. And this acrylic is very thick, so I'd say you're safe, but there's no need to over tighten them at all. And there. As you tighten these down, you're pulling that active backplate block down onto the thermal pads. So there's going to be a little bit of movement as it crushes those pads in between it for good contact. There, we're all the way in. Good idea to go back around because as you pull this side down, some of these may have loosened up. Just make sure they're all as snug as they should be. Anytime you have movement underneath it while you're tightening, it's always a good idea to go back around. Okay, those are all down. Let's see if these are going to line up now. Oh, there we go. Yep. Okay. Look at this. some of these actually do have a seal on them. You can go a little tighter with these. They're also longer. You know, still don't need to over tighten them, but there is a seal involved in this one. Okay, and take our nameplate and just pop it back on, and that job is done. So there it is, guys, all together and ready to go. This thing will handle anything you want to throw at it. A word of warning though, if you're curious, because I know I was, this whole assembly weighs 7.5 pounds. So if you're thinking about mounting it horizontally in a traditional setup, make sure you've got a good graphics card support, because there's not a motherboard out there that will handle that kind of weight. If you guys have any questions or missed any details, you can leave me a comment here below, or you can find me on Reddit. Username is TitanRig. I'm there every day for you guys. And having said that, thanks very much for watching. Another huge thank you to EK for sending us this amazing product, and we will catch you guys next time.